The moment I signed the lease for the old Victorian-style duplex on Marigold Street, I thought I was simply becoming a tenant, someone paying rent, maybe fixing a leaky faucet now and then, living below the radar. It didn't occur to me that this building would turn into one of the most unexpectedly dramatic chapters of my life. I opened the envelope, full of what I assumed were standard disclosures: lead paint warnings, termite inspections, yellowing sheets about noise ordinances. Among them was a document marked welcome packet from the Marigold Meadows Homeowners Association HOA, which struck me as odd because I was certain this property was outside any homeowners association zone. But as a busy professional with limited time, I glanced at it, checked the little box and tucked it away. The building felt straightforward: 2 units, a front porch with chipping paint, a backyard with overgrown grass, and a rent that seemed too good to be true. I poked around a bit, noted the creaking staircase, and asked the landlord a few questions. "Oh yes, the HOA rules apply here," he said, "but they're very reasonable. Just keep the lawn mowed, no loud parties after 10, and that's it." It seemed manageable. So I signed the lease, moved in, stacked boxes, unpacked, and started settling in. A month later, when the real estate market shifted, I found myself in a position where buying the building made sense financially. It was kind of falling into my lap. I made the decision almost impulsively. I arranged a visit to the title office, met with a lawyer, and before I knew it I owned that duplex. The old landlord handed me the deed, and I became the lucky owner of this little property I once believed I was simply renting. On my first morning as the owner, I brewed a pot of coffee and looked around the place in a way I never had before. I noticed the chipped window sills, the scuffed wooden floors, the sagging gutters. I realized the place needed more than minor fixes. I decided to give myself a few days to breathe, then set up a schedule of renovations. That very afternoon I wandered out to the backyard to inspect the landscape. The lawn was wild, the bushes untrimmed, and there was litter tucked under the porch. I planned to mow the lawn that weekend, clean out the flower beds, and maybe plant something simple like a few shrubs or some wildflowers. A manageable starter project. Yet as I scrolled through my email that evening, I noticed a new message in the subject line: HOA violation notice. My stare froze on the screen. The message claimed the property was subject to the HOA, and that the lawn had violated the minimum maintenance standard set by the association. It listed a fine schedule if the lawn wasn't mowed and the shrubs trimmed by a certain date. I clicked back into the welcome packet and sure enough, the HOA letterhead was there. It felt like a formality gone sideways. I checked the property map, the association bylaws. Everything seemed to imply the duplex was inside the HOA's named district. I called the association's management company, expecting a quick explanation, maybe a leftover notice from the former landlord. Instead, I got an odd statement: "Yes, the property is part of our association. The owner is responsible for lawn care and adherence to our standards." I replied, "But I bought the place just yesterday. I'm the owner now." The voice on the other end paused. "Okay, then the same standards apply." The conversation ended. I sat back, coffee mug in hand, absorbing the shift from tenant to mandated subject of rules I didn't know I'd agreed to. Still, I thought, this is minor. I'll mow the lawn. I'll fix up the landscaping. Problem solved. But as days passed, more notifications appeared: parking violations, notices about how many cars could be parked in the driveway, a requirement about recycling bins tucked out of sight. I began to feel the tangled threads of authority pulling tight around my new ownership. Then one night I stepped outside to see a couple of service vans parked on my driveway. They were delivering replacement windows I'd ordered. but the HOA fining schedule had a clause: no materials or large equipment may be stored on exterior driveways overnight without approval. I found myself filling out forms, waiting for responses, messaging the HOA management like I had before with a tenant question. Only now, I was the property owner, subject to the same maze of bureaucracy I assumed belonged to someone else. On top of this, I discovered parts of the building history that went unattended. The neighbor across the street mentioned the HOA used to send out letters annually for dues and assessments, but the former owner had ignored them. The lawn became overgrown, a broken porch step was fixed by a handyman neighbor not by the owner, and small complaints lingered. It seemed the property had simply been tolerated in a state of limbo, inside the HOA boundaries in paperwork, but practically ignored for years. That meant years' worth of fines or dues were floating in some ledger, the kind of thing that could escalate when a new owner arrives. I sat in my living room looking at the screen of my laptop where the HOA reminder highlighted delinquent accounts and historical violations. I realized what started as a manageable flip of property had just come with a hidden cost: the price of being part of a community that didn't quite remember I was joining. Then came the day when I decided to formally attend the community meeting the HOA scheduled. I mustered my notebook, prepared questions: what's the scope of maintenance, what are the annual dues, what happens if I don't agree with a particular rule. I walked into half a dozen neighbors gathered in the community room of a small church. The president of the HOA welcomed homeowners and tenants, and in that moment I realized I'd been addressed as tenant despite the deed being in my name. After introductions I stood and said, "I'm actually the new owner of number 21. There was a quiet pause. A few heads turned. The president asked, "Oh, welcome aboard, then." I shook hands. The feeling of being an outsider turned into the surreal awareness that I was now the aboard they'd been waiting for, or maybe didn't want waiting for. I left that meeting with a folder full of documents, a schedule of dues, the spreadsheet of fines, the welcome fee for new members, the architectural review board application. It hit me that this purchase wasn't just about the building, it was about entering a system of obligations and communities I hadn't bargained for so explicitly. I stepped into my car and drove home, mind racing with implications. At the driveway I paused and looked up at the facade of my building, the same old duplex but now enshrined in a new role. I wasn't just the owner anymore, I was a member of the HOA, whether I liked it or not. And I remembered the first welcome packet I had ignored as a lease signing formality. Now it felt like a contract I had never fully read, with clauses I had never considered. That evening I opened the packet again by choice, reading each bullet, each fine schedule, each category of violation. The first item on the list: owners are subject to community standards and the association has authority to levy fines and call for compliance. I exhaled. The coffee tasted weaker. And as I sat there, the realization settled: this property, which I had believed was mine to fix and enjoy and farm a little happiness out of, was part of a larger landscape of governance. I had thought I was stepping into freedom, in fact I was stepping into responsibility, some welcomed, some unexpected. The welcome packet lay open on the coffee table, the ink still crisp, while outside the lawn waited under autumn's gentle decline and the old porch step sagged under its weight. I knew what I was going to do next weekend: mow the grass, place the shrubbery, apply for approval for the windows. But I also knew something more important: I was now a stakeholder in a system I hadn't intended to join, and the first chapter of that story had already begun. The morning after the HOA meeting, I woke up with a strange mix of amusement and irritation. It was like I had joined a club I never applied for, and the club rules were written in invisible ink until the day you accidentally triggered one of their booby traps. I sipped my coffee slowly, staring out the window at the freshly mowed lawn, trying to understand how things had taken this turn. Less than 2 months ago, I was a renter. Now I owned the building and was somehow wrapped up in a passive-aggressive war with an HOA that didn't even realize I had any authority. That's when I decided to dig deeper into the ownership structure of the neighborhood and my own rights as a property owner. I needed to know exactly where I stood before I spent another weekend filling out applications to get permission to trim my own hedges. I spent hours going through property records, mapping boundaries, and reviewing HOA registration documents with the county. That's when I found something that made me sit straight up. According to the official plat and land use filings, my property was technically not within the jurisdiction of the HOA. The original boundary lines had been set decades ago, and while my duplex sat adjacent to the community, it had never been officially annexed into the HOA's governance. The welcome packet sent in error. The fines not legally binding. The meetings optional, at best. I checked with the property attorney just to be sure I wasn't imagining it. Her response was calm and definitive: they have no legal standing over your property. If they called the cops on you, they'd be wasting everyone's time. That should have been the end of it, but something about it didn't sit right with me. Why had the HOA acted so confidently? Why were they sending fines, issuing demands, and including me in meetings if they had no control over my lot? I drove through the neighborhood, looking closely at the street signs, the houses, the small decorative flags that hung from porches. It was a nice enough place, quiet, clean, predictable. The kind of neighborhood where everyone smiled but watched you through their blinds. And there was something in that observation that struck me: this HOA didn't operate on rules alone. It operated on assumptions, on fear, on people's unwillingness to question authority. Most people just complied because it was easier than pushing back. I realized then that if I wanted this to end, I'd have to make a point of proving I wasn't just another uninformed homeowner who would bend to their policies. That opportunity came faster than I expected. A few days later, I received another notice taped to my front door. This time, it was more aggressive. It cited a final warning for unauthorized renovations. Apparently, the delivery of my new porch railing materials had triggered another violation. The notice ended with a bold sentence stating, "Failure to comply will result in legal action and referral to local law enforcement." That was it for me. I took the letter, tucked it into a folder with my attorney's statement and the plat maps, and waited for the next HOA meeting. I didn't have to wait long. It was scheduled for that Saturday morning at the same community church. When I walked into the meeting, it was as if the air had changed. The same group of 6 or 7 board members sat around a fold-out table with stacks of papers, coffee cups, and highlighters. They looked up when I entered, most of them offering polite nods. The HOA president, a woman named Karen, really gestured toward the back of the room where I'd sat before. But this time I didn't go to the back. I walked straight to the front and placed my folder on the table in front of her. "Before we start," I said clearly, "I'd like to clarify something about my property." The room grew quiet. Karen raised an eyebrow but said nothing. I pulled out the plat map and laid it down. "This is my property," I said, pointing. "It's not within your HOA's registered boundaries. You've been operating under the assumption that it is, but that assumption is false. I've confirmed this with the county and with my attorney." Someone on the board, an older man with a clipboard, leaned forward, squinting. "Are you saying you're not part of the HOA?" I nodded. "That's exactly what I'm saying. And that means the fines you've issued, the notices you've posted, and the requirements you've demanded have no legal basis." Karen looked stunned. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. Then, almost defensively, she said, but your property was included in the welcome packet. It's always been treated as part of the HOA. I took a breath. That may be true in practice, but not in law. There's no official annexation. No signed consent. The previous owner may have tolerated your oversight, but I won't. So from this point forward, I'd appreciate it if the board ceased contact regarding HOA matters. If you persist, I'll treat it as harassment. The room was dead silent. A few board members exchanged looks. Someone coughed. I stood there for another beat, then turned and walked out. I didn't slam the door. I didn't raise my voice. But I left the weight of my words hanging behind me like smoke. I expected that to be the end of it. Maybe a few grumbles, maybe a half-hearted attempt to challenge my claim. What I didn't expect was what happened the next morning. I was in my backyard trimming branches when two police cruisers pulled up in front of my house. An officer stepped out and calmly walked up my driveway. "Sir, we received a call from a local homeowners association. They said you were doing unauthorized work on your property." I stared at him. "Is that a crime?" He hesitated. "We're just here to check. Do you have ID?" I handed it over without comment, then showed him the plat map and legal statement. He radioed back, waited a few moments, then handed everything back. "You're good. Sorry for the trouble. Sounds like a civil matter. Not our jurisdiction." I nodded. "Tell that to the HOA." He smiled faintly, then left. I stood there for a long time after the cruisers drove off, still holding my pruning shears. They had actually called the police on me for trimming a bush on my own land. I couldn't decide whether to laugh or scream. Later that afternoon, I typed up a formal letter to the HOA board, including a cease and desist notice regarding further contact or enforcement attempts. I attached copies of everything: the plat map, the title deed, the attorney's letter, even a transcript of the police visit. I had it delivered by certified mail. From that moment forward, the notices stopped. The threats vanished. But the stares from the neighbors didn't. I demarked myself as the person who pushed back. Not just someone outside the HOA, but someone who had embarrassed it publicly. That kind of scar doesn't fade quickly in a neighborhood like this. But for the first time in weeks, I felt like I had reclaimed my home. The house was still the same. The porch still needed painting. The grass still needed mowing. But now, finally, I felt like I was the one in control. Not the HOA. Not the neighbors. Me. It had been a week since the police came to my house, and while the HOA hadn't sent another notice, something in the air around the neighborhood had changed. People who once waved from across the street now gave short nods, and a few stopped acknowledging me at all. The couple next door, who used to bring over baked goods, suddenly stopped making eye contact. One evening I caught a group of residents clustered at the corner mailbox, speaking in hushed tones and glancing toward my house like I'd kicked over a hornet's nest. I wasn't surprised. I had done something people here weren't used to: challenging authority. It wasn't just that I refused to follow their made-up rules, it was that I had proven the people enforcing them didn't even have the right to. That kind of thing doesn't go over well in a place built on quiet compliance. But I hadn't come this far to worry about neighborhood gossip. I owned the building. I was putting money into fixing it. I wasn't just going to let the HOA's past behavior slide. So I did something I knew would make things a little more interesting: I reached out to the previous landlord. The man I'd bought the place from had always been a little evasive during the sale. he mentioned HOA drama only in vague terms and never really elaborated. I called him up under the pretense of asking about some plumbing issues, but eventually, I steered the conversation toward the HOA. That's when he finally admitted something that explained a lot years ago. The HOA had tried to strong-arm him into joining officially. They made verbal threats, sent bogus fines, and even went as far as to say he was morally obligated to participate in community standards. He ignored them, never signed anything, and eventually, they just stopped pressing him. But he never told them no outright. He just faded into the background, paid them no mind, and left the problem for someone else, me. Armed with that knowledge, I realized that not only was I not in the HOA, but I had never agreed to be. There was no grandfather clause, no signed consent, and no legal annexation. They simply treated the property like theirs out of habit and intimidation, and that meant every demand they made, every warning letter, every violation, they were all based on fiction. I decided to take one more step, something symbolic and bold enough to reset the power dynamic completely. I installed a small sign on the front porch that read "Private Property, not under HOA jurisdiction." It was discreet, professional looking, not aggressive or flashy, but the message was clear. Within 24 hours, I noticed people slowing their walks in front of the house. A few took photos. One woman stood across the street with her arms folded, just staring at it like I'd spray-painted profanity on my siding. That sign did exactly what I hoped it would do. It triggered the HOA to act one more time, and this time, they went too far. I came home to a notice taped to my door, this one on HOA letterhead but notably lacking any kind of legal language. It said my sign was unapproved external signage and needed to be removed within 48 hours to avoid escalated actions. It was the same empty threat cycle again, but now I had something better, proof of continued harassment after legal notification. I contacted my attorney again, and this time we drafted a formal response that not only reiterated my position but outlined my intention to pursue legal action if they continued making contact. That letter was also sent via certified mail. But I wasn't done. I took the next few days to research the HOA itself. I pulled their board filings, their incorporation papers, and even their tax status as a nonprofit. What I found was sloppy management, expired filings, missing signatures, and years of misfiled paperwork. It became clear that the HOA was functioning more like a social club than a real governing body. The icing on the cake came when I discovered the land beneath my building had a unique zoning designation that granted me specific rights not afforded to other properties in the HOA's actual jurisdiction. These included expanded freedom for renovations, signage, and even short-term leasing, something explicitly banned by the HOA bylaws. That gave me an idea. I listed the upstairs unit as a furnished rental for short-term guests. Within a week, I had my first tenant, a traveling nurse in town for a 6-week contract. She was quiet, respectful, and had no interest in the politics of suburban governance. But her presence did not go unnoticed. A few days into her stay, I got another letter. This one was hand-delivered, not mailed, and unsigned. It accused me of disrupting the community atmosphere and implied that short-term tenants were a threat to neighborhood safety. I didn't respond. I didn't have to. Every time they tried to enforce a rule, I had the law on my side. And every time they overstepped, they dug their own grave deeper. The breaking point came when a few board members approached my tenant directly and asked her to vacate the unit. That was the last straw. She told me about the interaction, and I immediately filed a complaint with the local housing authority. I also contacted my lawyer once again, and this time, we sent a cease and desist not just to the HOA but to the specific individuals involved. That was the move that finally shut everything down. After that, the messages stopped. The board went silent. The stares from the neighbors continued, but they carried a new tone, one of resentment, maybe even fear. I had become the homeowner they couldn't control, the one who exposed their overreach, who turned their rules against them. But the story didn't end there. As I settled into this new phase of ownership, I started thinking about the long term. I had legal rights. I had property value. I had leverage. What I didn't have yet was full control of the narrative. That changed when I started receiving calls from other neighbors, quiet ones, discreet ones. People asking how I handled the HOA, how I figured out I wasn't under their jurisdiction, and what they could do if they wanted to opt out. That's when it hit me. I wasn't just the guy who beat the HOA, I was now, unintentionally, their landlord in a broader sense. Because my duplex, positioned right on the edge of the community, had become a symbol of independence. I didn't plan to lead a revolt, but I also didn't plan to stay quiet. So I kept fixing the place. Repainted the porch. Installed new lighting. Landscaped the yard to my liking. I did everything the HOA tried to control, and I did it better than they ever could. And with every improvement, every guest who stayed in the rental, every day that passed without another threat or notice, I felt more secure in my ownership. More grounded. The HOA had called the cops on me. They had threatened me. But they never realized they were barking at the wrong house. I wasn't in their HOA. I was the new landlord. And the rules, they weren't theirs to write anymore.